Rank and Review, I'll be taking a look at the 3 Golden Axe beat-em-ups for the Sega Mega Drive Genesis, and listing them from my least to most favorite. That's pretty self-explanatory, I think, so how's about we just get started?
Let's go!
All 3 of these games are super tight in my opinion, so don't get too bent out of shape by the order. I mean, this is a pretty remarkable home port of the Golden Axe arcade experience, and one of the first Genesis titles I remember playing in 1989 at a friend's house. The thing is, I didn't own Sega's 16-bit machine until the following year, and I played Golden Axe in the arcade almost daily, so when I think of this game, I think of that coin-up original more than this Genesis take. For those who didn't have that alternative, this was a great way of experiencing it. Makoto Uchida designed Golden Axe to be a sort of fantasy take on Double Dragon with some Street Fighter combos in the mix, and I think he did a decent job achieving his goals here. It's also kinda wild how soon this cart dropped on the console after the arcade release. 7 months it took Sega to port this thing over. Now that's impressive. Golden Axe features 3 playable protagonists: Gilius Thunderhead, the dwarf, Axe Battler, your typical Conan clone, and Tyrus Flare, a long sword-wielding Amazon. Together they are tasked with ridding the land of Uria of the evil Death Adder, who has captured the king and his daughter. The Golden Axe is the MacGuffin that the antagonist is holding in his possession. It's a simple swords and sorcery story, but it serves its purpose well, and each of the controllable characters have their own strengths and weaknesses, even if they do feel rather slight. Basically, Axe Battler is the well-rounded one, while Tyrus and Gilius lean towards either end of the power scale, with the latter being, apparently, the strongest overall. The game is relatively short with a difficulty that ramps up quickly, but it's a fair challenge. Your chosen warrior has a life bar which can be extended in the options. The standard is 3, but once that is bled dry, you'll need to use a continue, which is pretty standard stuff. Now, the options, they're quite extensive for an early game on the Sega hardware, with the ability to change the button layout as well as a sound test mode, which I'm a huge fan of in any game. Your life can be adjusted, so you might as well go ahead and bump it up to the max. Golden Axe might be brief, but it's anything but easy. Enemies are extremely aggressive and they cling to you like a nasty smell. To this day, I still have to be in the right mood to play this one. I'm a grown-ass man, and Golden Axe can make me rage like a rotten little toddler. I guess it's important to note that the 2-player gameplay you're seeing is of my wife and I hammering our way through it, and the solo stuff is taken from Sonic's Ultimate Genesis collection on the Xbox 360. Anyway, her and I were just losing our minds playing this thing. It has been a while, and man is this a frustrating co-op experience. And before I have to read a bunch of get good comments or whatever, her and I normally do pretty well when it comes to beat-em-ups. We've played through the Streets of Rage series a gazillion times, and have gotten through some pretty tough arcade titles. The stages in Golden Axe are a lot more densely designed, with narrower paths than most brawlers, which resulted in us constantly bludgeoning each other. What's worse is that the enemies sort of corral you into one place, and when one of you has to use a shared continue, it often plops you right in front of the other. To be clear, it places you right in the middle of the screen, but that's just normally where all of the action happens. I can't think of a way of improving this off the top of my head, but it was a consistent issue across all 3 games. Normally I dig it when beat-em-ups allow the players to damage each other, but I find it frustrating and cumbersome here, mostly due to how limited the fighting arenas are from screen to screen. There's no option to disable it, so get used to being your buddy's piñata from time to time. That's what friends are for. On top of that, the hit detection can be pretty abysmal at times, and the special moves are a bit tough to pull off. The home port does have an extra level at the end, and the conclusion is as awesome as the arcade original, so those are 2 things working in this port's favor. The berry-wielding baddies can charge across the screen, stun you with repeated attacks, and overwhelm you pretty quickly here. I mean, on one hand, I applaud the developers for their ambition, but on the other, it gets frustrating fast. Especially, like I said, with a co-op friend. Usually when I play these types of games, I'll opt for the high or low road, while my partner does the opposite. In this game, you're all mashed up together in an orgy of skeletons and club-wielding mustachioed men. For the record, that's not my idea of a good time. Unless it's a Thursday evening and I've had a few drinks. Okay, so it certainly sounds like I dislike this game, but that's not true. I'm just airing some grievances that I've had all bottled up within me since this thing's inception. The arcade version is largely the same, but for whatever reason, it just feels better to me, which is weird, because I can't even articulate what it is that I prefer about it. I guess I'll have to do a video about it. One thing's for damn sure, they both feel rather rigid, a bit sticky even. I'm sure they were going for a movement and attack style that felt weighty due to the setting, but ultimately, there's a certain amount of inertia that bogs the pace down a bit. Like I said earlier, the enemies gravitate towards you like they're missing a mother, but I just can't seem to take down one of them before another one is gently ramming my ass with a gilded, oversized piece of bush fruit. I just can't seem to ever get away from all of the jelly making, and yeah, I know. That's probably just a me problem. I am pretty goddamn irresistible after all. With all of those negative nitpicks out of the way, I've gotta say, Golden Axe is pretty fun to play once you've nailed the rhythm, and evidently a three-way rhyme. Most of the time, your goal is to just get ahead of the enemy ambushes, and when you get into a groove, it's extremely rewarding, meaty, and visceral. The sound effects are punchy with a lot of low-end thumps and booms, which add a lot to the overall experience, though I could have done without the overused shout everything makes when it dies. It also cuts out the music a little bit, which is jarring to say the least. The graphics are colorful, but also very sharp, with a lot of intricate details that change frequently throughout the stages. Between each level, you'll be shown a bit more of the story as well, and I've gotta say, it has been well over 3 decades, and this thing is still a looker. I mean, not as sexy as that, oh my god, but oh, man face! Man face! In between levels, you'll also be gifted the opportunity to release some of your inner chipmunk hatred by booting these fuzzy, buck-toothed thieves. Alvin, Simon, Theodore, magic potions, chunks of meat. It's very memorable and oh so satisfying in a mature, healthy kind of way.
Boot him! Boot him! God, smash him up! Smash him! Chipmunks!
Magic potions fill up a meter, which enables your protagonist to use a screen wipe spell. The higher the earn level, the bigger the boom. It offers up a bit of variety and makes you more aware of your special attacks. In co-op mode, it forces the participants to communicate a bit more than normal, which is good if you like talking to people. And hey, if you're extra chatty, you can beat the crap out of a friend or loved one in this duel mode, which is pretty basic, but it sorta lets you figure out your character's moves outside of the normal game. This next point is probably the pettiest of all gripes, but there's no indication on the title screen that you can play the game cooperatively. The second player needs to press start to become activated, which is a really small thing, admittedly, to be pissed about, but it kind of annoys me still. Mounts are here, straight from the arcade. Mounts. These lumbering beasts from nightmare books of fantastic treachery have unique attacks, such as fire breathing or tail whipping. It evens out the score quite well, and they take a few hits of damage before they cowardly run off the screen, to live out the rest of their lives in eternal shame. So perhaps the best thing Golden Axe does when it comes to gameplay is how it pretty much teaches you straight out of the gate that button mashing will get you nowhere. The combat isn't deep, but it does require the player to switch things up here and there. That being said, you can achieve a certain amount of success by spamming the charge attack, since it not only damages enemies, but gives you a bit more breathing room. Yo Takada's score is fitting and memorable, with a lot of catchy, appropriate pieces of music. Sometimes the treble can be a bit too shrill, but this is an early title for the 16-bit Sega unit, so it deserves some leeway. The arrangements are solid, and the translation of tracks to the home cart were dealt with gracefully for the most part. And that's how I feel about the game as a whole. Golden Axe is a solid arcade to console conversion with little to no hiccups. Sure, I have some problems with it, but the ones stated are mostly due to my opinion of this Genesis Mega Drive series as a whole. I've always been more of a Streets of Rage guy, but it's unfair to pit this series up against that, since it's much older and does its own thing. Golden Axe is a bona fide classic that really doesn't deserve to be last on this list, but hey, that's just how the cookie crumbled today. When I played them all back to back, it kinda surprised me that I decided that this was my least favorite, even if they are very close.
No!
Jazzy, different but the same. This one's going to take no time to talk about. How do you make a sequel that you know will sell? Well, you pretty much release the same game in a more polished package. Released in late 1991 in Japan and early the following year in North America and PAL regions, Golden Axe 2 takes the same three characters, the same general mechanics, and the same basic stage designs, and tweaks them just enough to not scare loyal fans of the series away. They just jazzed it up a little bit. This time, the plot is based around an evildoer named Dark Guld, who possesses the Golden Axe. What they did with the magical mythical MacGuffin after retrieving it the last time is anyone's guess, but here it is, yet again stolen by someone new. Regardless, the game is mostly the same, with some differences that are immediately noticeable. Our lovable, scantily clad protagonists feel more nimble, with a lot less of that sticky feeling holding them back. Almost everything feels more refined this time around. You can now pick enemies up and toss them in either direction, and you can also do a sweeping circular attack by pressing jump in conjunction with the action button. That makes it easier to get a baddie out of your grill. The swinging of the weapons just feels smoother overall, with cleaner animations. Everything looks a little nicer, maybe not 2 or 3 years after the original nicer, but nicer just the same, nicer. The combat is much more fluid, with the same amount of responsive action as its predecessor, with a reworked magic system that is the best in this console series, in my opinion. You see, in the first game, you could be carrying one or a full bar of urns, and the screen wipe would work once to varying degrees of effectiveness. In Golden Axe 2, you can tap that secret special button in order to use a portion of your blue goodness, or hold it down for a bigger boom. It doesn't sound like much on paper, but in practice, it changes the way you use your powers. Normally, I like to save my super dupers for the big bads and beat 'em ups, or hack and slashers and whatnot, but in this game, if you're surrounded by a bunch of lowly minions and need some breathing room, you can use a tiny smasher to reset their patterns. It's a welcomed tweak. Oh, and those pesky little rodents have been replaced by these Orko-looking magic men. They're the same, but different, and a little less satisfying to boot fuck. As for everything else, it's all here. The dual mode is present and largely unchanged. All three characters wield their famous weapons, and demon mounts can still be used to gain an advantage. One thing I didn't mention when it came to the first game was how repetitive the enemies start to feel after a while, and well, look, it was hard for beat-em-ups at the time to really avoid that, so I don't think it's all that fair to belabor that point, considering that is kind of what they're known for. There are some exceptions, such as the terrific arcade-exclusive Golden Axe sequel that I'll be covering in an upcoming video, but I think by and large the first one did a good job keeping things interesting. Oddly enough, though, the baddies in this console-only follow-up start getting boring for me after the second stage. What's weird is that I think these levels are a bit shorter, too. The first Golden Axe had some pretty average bosses at best, with heaps of regular peons added into the fray to artificially add some challenge. This one does the same thing, but I find that the end of stage brutes are better designed as a whole, with a variety of different attacks. Don't get me wrong, they aren't reinventing the wheel here when it comes to boss encounters, but what's here is a bit better. I mean, I can barely remember the majority of them from the first one. Sometimes they'll even switch things up by having you face off against a bunch of smaller enemies in lieu of one big bad, which makes the end of the stages feel like challenge encounters rather than a large-scale fight, if that makes any sense. This is sacrilege, and I kinda don't want to admit it because Hideo Takada's score is so iconic to me, you know, from my time with the original in the arcades. But this second Golden Axe's soundtrack is better in almost every way. I mean, in my opinion, of course. Naofumi Hataya must have been channeling some inner Yuzo Koshiro when he began work on this thing, because it's very Sega sounding. There are a few tracks here that could be used in a Shinobi game, which I understand might not necessarily be everyone's cup of tea when it comes to Golden Axe, but it works well for me. I mean, it's kinda apples and oranges considering that this game dropped so much later than the original, but the audio fidelity all around is much more varied, dynamic, and warm. The harmonies, the groove, it's a little jazzy, but it also has a nice swing to it. Tyrus has had some much needed facial reconstructive surgery to look a lot less like Axe Battler, and apparently a boob job because we're now in the 90s, and hey, I know it's a shallow point to address, but maybe I'm just a poor sod in love. Ditch the melons though, honey. Au naturel is beauty to me, baby, and would you get a load of Axe Battler's legs? That loincloth leaves nothing to the imagination. Tan, long limbs of succulent man meat right there if you ask me, but you didn't. So, moving on. Some things have changed, but by and large this is mostly the same game with a facelift. The multiplayer respawns are still kinda crap as far as I'm concerned, and the stages often aren't large enough for co-op golden axing. Enemies cower off screen any chance they can get, though a bit less frequently, if I'm being fair. At times, the difficulty overall feels a lot less balanced than its predecessor, with some pretty jarring spikes towards the latter half of the game, but the gorgeous arena that houses the final encounter is well worth the effort. This time the second player option is slap dab in your face on the title screen for dummies like me, and the difficulty can be set to your preference. Basically, at the end of the day, Golden Axe 2 is a little nicer to play, with a shinier veneer. It barely edges out the original for me, only because I feel that the few tweaks make it slightly more enjoyable overall.
Delay that order, number one. Red alert.
The thing that is inherently anticlimactic about these lists is that you already know the end result once you've gotten to a certain point. Plus, people gonna be pissed no matter what the outcome is. So, let's talk about the Revenge of Death Adder instead. Nah, that's not how this works. Though, that review is done, but it won't be uploaded for a couple more weeks. So now you're stuck with this. This is it. And I can't even believe I'm placing it here at number 1. But after scientifically analyzing all of these titles in my secret laboratory on Neptune, I've decided that this is my favorite Mega Drive Genesis Golden Axe game. It was a grueling process with a lot of weighing and many casualties, but it's just a bit better than the other two, in my humble opinion. At the start of this rank and review project, I was certain that this list would have been the inverse, but I think I dig this third entry a smidge more based on the stage variety and unique movesets of the now 4 playable characters. Golden Axe 3 doesn't really feel like any of the other games in the series. Insult or not, it kinda just plays like one of the many other beat-em-ups at the time, and boy, were there many during this era. It's kinda sad that this series started off being one of the more original concepts in the genre, only to sorta conform with the masses. But what can I say? There's more to sink your teeth into here for a home release. That is, if you lived in Japan, or were one of the 27 people in North America with the Sega Channel, because this one wasn't officially released anywhere else at the time. Nowadays, it's playable on the Sega Genesis collection for the PS2 and PSP, as well as the always awesome to bring up Sonic's Ultimate Genesis collection on the 360 and PS3. But back then, this one stayed in Japan. The first thing that you'll likely notice is that the visuals are drab. They're really washed out, and everything has a sort of grainy Sonic 3 kinda aesthetic that I can't say I'm a fan of. It's weird, A lot of Mega Drive Genesis exclusives started going this route when it came to their graphics, and for the life of me, I can't understand why. The lively color and presentation overall has taken a hit here, and there are little to no story beats in between stages, or really any added bells and whistles to add to the experience. For the first time in the console series, we're introduced to new characters to play as, but this largely depends on the version you own, and I guess what you consider to be Golden Axe canon. I'm not really balls deep into the lore when it comes to these games, but in this one, we have Proud Krager, who is this giant dude, a Black Panther named Kronos Evil Rate, and two characters that are either Axe Battler and Tyrus Flare, if you played the Sega Channel localization, or Kane Grinder and Sarah Byrne, respectively, if you're sticking with the Japanese original. It's strange. A lot of these decisions seem so arbitrary and, frankly, stupid. But this was the era of Sega doing ridiculous things, almost as if they just didn't want to exist or last as a company at all anymore. This time, a new evildoer named Demud Hellstrike, aka the Prince of Darkness, has stolen the Golden Axe and cursed the warriors. Gilius Thunderhead is back, but he isn't a playable protagonist this time around. Instead, he takes to the background to toss some exposition your way. Look, people, this dwarf has had enough already with the ineptness of these citizens. He has helped save the Golden Axe a few times, and still it continues to be taken by evil forces. I can't say I really blame him. From what I've read, Golden Axe 3 got panned by major video game magazines and critics at the time, with IGN stating that this thing didn't come to North America because Sega allegedly said it wasn't up to the quality of the first two. Yeah, I don't know about that, because this game really isn't that bad, and outside of the washed out visuals, it's a good entry, with quite a few new things going on. The biggest difference is in how each character controls. For the most part, they are animated really well and have a ton of new moves, including a block mechanic that I could never really get the hang of. It actually got in the way more than it was useful, with me accidentally performing it while trying to do something else. Conceptually, it was a great idea, as many of the enemies guard themselves as well, but it's sloppily executed. Maybe it would have been better if it were assigned to two buttons, like holding them down would allow your warrior to stand still and block or something. I don't know. As for the rest of the moves, they can be performed by inputting specific button combinations, which is really great and adds more depth to the combat. Some of these are a little tricky to pull off, but once again, you're able to test out your skills in a duel mode that has seen a bit of a facelift. All four of the playable protagonists can be chosen in these head-to-head arenas, with one of the bosses from the game, Eve, being a fifth option. For the first time in the series, you'll also be able to pick which backdrop you'd like your fight to take place in, which is a nice touch. The entire mode now plays out a lot more similarly to a typical fighting game, with less ground to roam around on and a fancy new health bar. It's still rudimentary and bland, but these tweaks make these versus battles flow a little better and end much quicker than before, since the players have less room to wander. Unfortunately, the gameplay overall is about as stiff as it ever was, which is really a shame, as this is the one thing that I wish they would have improved on. It feels a bit more like the first Golden Axe in the way it controls, which is a bit of a step backwards from the second entry's slicker style. This time, there are two difficulty options, normal and hard, and you can't choose how much life you start out with. Saving prisoners throughout the game will grant you extra lives, which adds a bit more strategy to how you take on the levels. The stages themselves are much different than the ones we've seen before. There's a lot more variety overall, with portions of some taking place on moving vehicles. You'll also be able to choose your path quite a few times throughout the journey, which adds a lot to the replay value of this sequel. It's one of the main reasons I consider this third entry the best, as it doesn't feel quite as linear to get from point A to B. In between stages, the chipmunks and orcos have been replaced by angry, hooded little beaver boys, and this trope is just kinda getting old at this point. While we were playing this cooperatively, we just started getting annoyed by these little punks, but this time around they do subvert your expectations a bit by playing little games with you, such as Hide the Meat Slab. Okay, look people, don't play Hide the Meat Slab, especially in public. It will land you some jail time and a permanent criminal record. Trust me. Just trust me on this one. Some stuff in the stages can be bashed open in order to reveal magic pots, food, and hearts. The latter increases your maximum health, so again, we have something new and interesting brought to the table here. Beaver Boys also drop all of these goods out in the wild, with a little encouragement from your melee weapons, or boot souls. As always, the more urns you have in your inventory, the more powerful the screen wipe, though the magic works similarly to how it did in the first game, with no option to control the amount used. What's cool is that you can perform a co-op spell in the two-player mode, but our collective lack of skills as a cohesive unit couldn't pull it off, so there's no footage of it. Both characters can also do some attacks together as well, which is a nice touch, but again, like many of the moves in Golden Axe 3, it can be a bit cumbersome to achieve. I appreciate all of these inclusions to the admittedly tired combat mechanics, but a lot of them feel rather over-designed in my opinion. Still, with enough practice, these additions do make this a much more complex beat-em-up than its predecessors. Naofumi Hataya has returned to compose the score, along with Tatsuyuki Maeda and Haruyo Ogura, and the arrangements are handled about as well as those from the second game, probably even better, but the audio fidelity is a bit muffled and scratchy, which is a real shame. There are a generous amount of original numbers here too, which makes the overall experience feel a lot less repetitive, but yeah, the quality of it all is a bit lackluster. It's almost like Sega had a great game here all around and tossed a big, warm heap of mud over it. The visuals, the sound, the gameplay, it's all there with some quality, but there's a brown paste smeared across all of it that leaves the entire package feeling a tad less impressive than the sum of all of its parts. The mounts return again, the Bizarrans, but I find it much tougher to stay on them as you get knocked off with one hit, and enemies really zero in on you. For the first time in the series, I just sort of leave them be as a result, to the rejoice of all of the mountable creatures everywhere. Their area of attack feels significantly diminished as well, which is a bit of a bummer, and wow, it really doesn't sound like I like this game at all, does it? But I do. I'm just not a big fan of the Golden Axe console series, as much as I am of some of its contemporaries and competitors. I think that's what's showing here in this review. Like, I'm trying to be fair, but I also have to be honest. Also, for the first time in the series, I noticed a bit of slowdown, which is a bit of a mystery considering the sheer majestic power of the Sega hardware, but it was there and quite distracting. Similarly to the other games, you'll pretty much see all of the enemy types by about the 75% point into the journey, but the baddies sport quite a few new moves this time around, which keeps things engaging until the end. Still though, it would have been nice if a few more were added, especially later on in the game where you'll just be fighting the same variety as those from the beginning with different color schemes. Again, this is an issue with the majority of beat-em-ups, so I can't be too harsh a critic. The bosses are slightly more aggressive and interesting all around in Golden Axe 3 with a bit less reliance on minion spawns, which is always a good thing, but again, they get a tad repetitive towards the end. For Star Wars fans, you'll likely enjoy taking down wave after wave of these Rancor handlers, but sadly, no Rancor boss to battle with. You will get to spar with some of the heroes gone bad, with putrid pixie dust curse spells all over them, so that's nifty. Enemies don't resort to going off screen quite as much here, which is also an improvement. Like I said before, this is single-handedly my biggest gripe with this genre of games, but it's slightly less annoying here in Golden Axe 3, likely due to the enemy AI and how aggressively they want to be right up next to you. Despite all of its shortcomings and a couple of regressions, such as the magic system and combat fluidity, I do think that this is the best Golden Axe game on the Sega Mega Drive Genesis. The added offensive moves are a real treat to learn, and the inclusion of a defense mechanic make this a much more interesting experience overall for me. It's still short and brutally challenging at times, but there's just a lot more variety, with enough diverging paths to warrant multiple attempts. Like I said at the top, all of these games are really close for me. Normally when I set out to do one of these videos, I have a pretty firm grasp of the order I want to exhibit these things in. But when it comes to Golden Axe, I think they're all starting to show their age a bit more than some of their contemporaries. This is clearly purely subjective, obviously, but I didn't have as much fun revisiting these classics as I hoped I would. The arcade original will always be a special experience for me, but I already talked about that a bit in our Golden Axe Warrior review, and as great as all of these games look, they feel rather stiff and clunky. I've gotta say, I'm a bit disappointed since I remember all of these Genesis versions so fondly, and hey, I'm not saying they're bad because they really aren't, but if I were to compare the series as a whole to, let's say, Streets of Rage, which isn't necessarily fair, it would sit at a full letter grade below it at a B+. The first Golden Axe came out in 1989, so it gets a pass for being as innovative as it was at the time, but by the third entry, this series really didn't have any excuses for feeling so antiquated. Other games were simply doing it better by the early 90s, with Capcom knocking it out of the park with some of their swords and sorceries beat-em-ups. I'm sure some of you might disagree, so I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Just be respectful. Next time on this channel, more Golden Axe. For those who have missed it, we have full reviews of both of the spin-off games in the series, Axe Battler and Golden Axe Warrior, so be sure to check those out in the meantime.